My adopted son refused to call me dad, until the night I got arrested. They say blood is thicker than water, but nothing tests the bonds of fatherhood quite like a pair of handcuffs and a choice that changes everything. Hey everyone, before we get into the video, don't forget to subscribe and smash that like button if you want more stories just like this. Thanks for the support. Lucas, age 36. The silence in our small suburban kitchen wasn't the peaceful kind that comes with solitude. It was the heavy, suffocating kind that filled every corner of the room, pressing against my eardrums like a physical weight. I sat at the round oak table, staring at the steam rising from my coffee mug, watching the swirls of cream dissipate into the dark liquid. It was 6:30 in the morning, and the house felt less like a home and more like a museum exhibit of a life that was never fully lived. Across from me sat Leo. He was 15, with a tangled mess of dark hair that fell over his eyes and a permanent scowl etched into his features that made him look much older than his years. He was aggressively shoveling spoonfuls of cereal into his mouth, the clinking of the metal against the bowl the only sound breaking the morning stillness. He refused to look at me, focusing his gaze intensely on the pattern of the tablecloth as if it contained the secrets of the universe. It had been 2 years since the adoption papers were signed, 2 years since I brought him home from the group home, where he had spent the majority of his childhood. In the beginning, the social workers had warned me. They told me that trauma had a way of rooting itself deep inside a child, growing like a weed that choked out any attempt at affection. They said it would take time, patience, and an endless reservoir of empathy. I thought I was prepared. I had read every book on attachment disorder, watched every documentary, and filled the house with every conceivable comfort a teenage boy could want. But nothing could have prepared me for the sheer magnitude of his indifference. It wasn't that he was violent or aggressive. Those would have been easier to handle. It was that he treated me like a ghost, a transparent entity that inhabited the same space but had no real impact on his world. I was the man who signed the permission slips, the man who bought the groceries, the man who drove the car. But I was not his father. I cleared my throat, the sound scraping awkwardly against the silence. I watched his shoulders tense up, a subtle physical cue that he acknowledged my existence but wished he didn't. I asked him if he had finished his history project, a benign question, a simple attempt at parental engagement. He didn't answer immediately. He just took another bite of cereal, chewed slowly, and swallowed. Finally, without lifting his eyes, he mumbled a single word. It was a confirmation, a bare minimum response designed to end the conversation before it began. He didn't call me Dad. He never did. He called me Lucas. It wasn't said with malice or spite, but with a detached precision that hurt more than any insult could. It was a boundary line drawn in the sand, a way of keeping me at arm's length, a reminder that while I might have legal custody, I had not earned the title. I stood up and took my mug to the sink, rinsing it out with unnecessary care. I watched the water swirl down the drain, feeling a familiar sense of helplessness wash over me. I wanted to grab him by the shoulders and shake him, to demand that he see how much I cared, to force him to accept the love I was offering. But I knew that was the wrong move. Pushing him would only make him retreat further into his shell. I turned around, leaning against the counter, and looked at him again. He was finished with his breakfast. He stood up, placed his bowl in the sink, careful not to touch me, and grabbed his backpack. He walked toward the door, his movements fluid and silent. Just as his hand touched the knob, he paused for a fraction of a second. I held my breath, hoping for a glance, a nod, anything. But he just pulled the hood of his jacket over his head and walked out into the crisp morning air. The door clicked shut behind him, and I was left alone in the quiet kitchen, wondering if I would ever truly reach him, or if I was just destined to be the man who provided the roof over his head and nothing more. The days that followed were a blur of routine and misconnections. I worked as a structural engineer, a job that required precision and patience, traits that I desperately tried to apply to my home life. But while steel and concrete were predictable, governed by laws of physics that never changed, a 15-year-old boy was a chaotic variable that defied all logic. I spent my days designing bridges that connected people and places, Yet I couldn't seem to build a bridge across the 3 feet of space between Leo and me at the dinner table. I decided that weekend that a change of scenery was necessary. The suffocating silence of the house was becoming unbearable, and I thought that perhaps, in the neutral territory of the outdoors, the walls might come down just a little. I planned a fishing trip. It was a cliché, I knew that. It was the stereotypical father-son bonding activity, a trope straight out of a feel-good movie, but I was desperate. I packed the car with rods, tackle boxes, and a cooler full of sandwiches, hoping that the rhythmic act of casting a line might soothe the turbulent waters between us. When I told Leo about the plan on Friday evening, his reaction was predictable. He stared at his phone, thumbs flying across the screen, and shrugged. I told him it would just be for the day, that we didn't have a talk if he didn't want to, but that I wanted us to just be near each other. He didn't agree, but he didn't explicitly refuse either, which in my mind was a victory. I took his silence as consent. Saturday morning dawned gray and overcast, the sky heavy with the promise of rain. We drove out to Lake Crescent, a secluded spot about an hour from the city. The car ride was, as expected, filled with nothing but the hum of the engine and the low sound of the radio I had turned on just to fill the void. Leo stared out the window, watching the blur of trees pass by, his face unreadable behind the curtain of his hair. When we arrived at the lake, the air was cold and smelled of pine and damp earth. We unloaded the gear and hiked down to a rocky pier that jutted out into the dark water. It was beautiful in a melancholic sort of way. The silence here felt different than it did at home. It was less oppressive, more natural. We set up our chairs and cast our lines. For the first hour, nothing happened. The bobber floated motionless on the surface of the water. I watched Leo out of the corner of my eye. He was sitting with his knees pulled up to his chest, his hood up, looking out at the horizon. I tried to initiate a conversation about school, specifically a subject I knew he enjoyed, science. I told him about an article I had read about deep-sea exploration. He didn't look at me, but I saw him shift his weight slightly, listening. I kept talking, describing the bioluminescent creatures and the crushing pressure of the deep ocean. For a moment, just a fleeting moment, I saw a spark of interest. He turned his head slightly, his eyes focusing on the middle distance where I was pointing with my hand. It was the first time he had actually acknowledged me in days. Then, his fishing rod bent violently. The tension snapped him out of his trance. He grabbed the rod, his knuckles turning white as he fought the fish on the other end. I stood up immediately, rushing over to help him guide it in. For a few chaotic minutes, we were a team. I shouted instructions on how to reel it in, how to keep the line tight, and he actually listened, his breathing heavy and ragged. We worked together, the silence broken by the splash of water and the whir of the reel. Finally, he hauled a large, speckled trout onto the pier. It flopped on the wet wood, gasping for air. Leo stared at it, a look of genuine surprise breaking through his usual mask of indifference. For a second, our eyes met. I smiled at him, a wide, goofy smile of encouragement. I waited for him to return it, or at least to soften. But instead, the mask slammed back into place. He unhooked the fish with rough, efficient movements and threw it back into the water before I could say a word. He sat back down, put his headphones on, and turned his back to me. The moment was gone, vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving me standing there feeling more foolish and defeated than ever before. The failure of the fishing trip hung over me like a storm cloud. I had seen a crack in the armor, a glimpse of the boy beneath the scowl, but I had failed to capitalize on it, and he had retreated even further. Monday arrived with a sense of dread. I noticed small things changing around the house. Items were moved slightly. The latch on the back gate was left unsecured. Food went missing from the pantry, not snacks that a growing teenager might eat, but specific things that could be easily sold or traded. A package of expensive steaks I had bought for a special dinner vanished from the freezer. When I asked him about it, he just looked at me with those dead eyes and claimed he hadn't been in the freezer. I knew he was lying, but I didn't have the energy to fight him. I was tired of the constant battle for truth. I just let it slide, a mistake I would soon regret. The tension in the house began to feel dangerous. It wasn't just indifference anymore. It was a low-level hum of hostility. I started finding receipts in his jeans pockets when I did the laundry, receipts from pawn shops and electronic stores I knew we couldn't afford. My heart sank. I realized that his silence wasn't just about emotional distance. It was covering up a secret life. I began to worry about who he was with when he wasn't at school or in his room. I knew he was skipping classes occasionally. The school had called, but Leo always had a plausible excuse, and the administration, overwhelmed with underfunded resources, rarely pushed back. I felt like I was losing control of the situation entirely. I was the father, the adult, the one supposed to be steering the ship, but I was navigating blind through a fog, waiting for the inevitable collision. One Thursday evening, I came home early from work because of a migraine. The house was quiet, too quiet. Leo's door was closed, as usual, but I heard a low murmur of voices coming from inside. I paused in the hallway, my hand hovering over the doorknob. I knew I should respect his privacy, but the instinctual alarm bells in my head were ringing. I slowly turned the handle and pushed the door open just a crack. Leo was sitting on the edge of his bed, his back to me. He was holding his phone, and he wasn't scrolling. He was talking. The tone of his voice was different than I had ever heard it. Urgent, fearful, and subservient. He wasn't talking to a friend. He was taking orders. I caught fragments of the conversation, words about drops, watching out, and the guy coming by later. My blood ran cold. I closed the door silently and retreated to my room, my mind racing. I spent the next hour pacing the floor of my bedroom. I was an engineer, a man who solved problems. I needed to assess the structural integrity of this situation before it collapsed on top of us. I realized that Leo wasn't just acting out for attention. He was involved in something illicit, likely drugs or theft, driven by a need for money or perhaps a sense of belonging that he couldn't find at home. I felt a crushing wave of guilt. Had I pushed him into this? Had my inability to connect with him forced him to find connection with the wrong people? I knew I couldn't confront him directly. If I did, he would bolt. He would run away, and then I would have no way to protect him. I had to be smarter. I had to catch him in the act, not to punish him, but to intercept him before he crossed a line he couldn't come back from. I decided that night that I would follow him. The next time he left the house, I would be right behind him, a shadow in the dark, making sure he didn't destroy his life. The opportunity presented itself 2 nights later. It was a Saturday, and the rain was coming down in sheets, turning the city streets into slick mirrors reflecting the streetlights. Around 10 o'clock, I heard the soft creak of the back door opening. I was already dressed in dark clothes, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I waited a moment, giving him a head start, before slipping out into the wet night. I didn't take my car. The engine would be too loud. I kept a safe distance, moving from shadow to shadow, relying on the cover of the storm. Leo moved with purpose, his hood pulled low, walking briskly toward the industrial district on the outskirts of town. This was an area of abandoned warehouses and rusted-out shipping containers, a place where legitimate business didn't happen after midnight. I followed him for nearly a mile, the cold rain soaking through my jacket. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to call out to him, to drag him back to the safety of his bedroom, but I forced myself to stay silent. I needed to know who he was meeting. I needed to know the depth of the trouble he was in. He stopped in front of a crumbling brick building that used to be a textile factory. A rusted metal door stood slightly ajar, emitting a faint, flickering orange light. Leo hesitated for a second, looking around, then slipped inside. I waited a moment, counting to 10, before creeping up to the building. I peered through a grimy window next to the door. Inside, the space was vast and empty, illuminated by a single construction light. I saw Leo standing there, facing 3 older men. They looked rough, hardened by the streets. One of them, a tall man with a jagged scar running down his neck, was shouting, though I couldn't hear the words through the thick glass. Leo looked small in comparison, his shoulders hunched, shaking. The tall man shoved Leo hard, sending him stumbling backward. That was it. The protective instinct that had been simmering beneath the surface boiled over. I didn't think about the danger. I didn't think about the fact that I was one man against three. I just knew that my son was in trouble. I burst through the door, the metal crashing against the brick wall. The sound echoed through the warehouse. The three men turned to look at me, surprise registering on their faces. I walked straight toward them, putting myself between Leo and the men. I shouted at them to leave him alone, my voice trembling but loud. The tall man laughed, a dry, rasping sound. He pulled a knife from his pocket, the glint of steel catching the light. He told me to mind my own business, that the kid owed them money and he was going to pay it one way or another. I looked back at Leo. His face was pale, his eyes wide with terror. He looked at me not with indifference, but with a desperate, pleading look that said, "Help me." I turned back to the leader and told him that if anyone was paying, it would be me. I reached for my wallet, but the leader wasn't interested in money. He swung the knife, a wild arc intended to intimidate. I lunged forward, grabbing the man's wrist. We struggled, grappling on the dirty concrete floor. The other two men jumped in, kicks and blows raining down on me. I fought back with everything I had, driven by a manic energy, but I was outnumbered. Suddenly, sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder by the second. Blue and red lights began to flash through the high windows. The men panicked, breaking away from the scuffle and running toward the back exit. I scrambled to my feet, breathless and bruised, checking on Leo. He was huddled in a corner, trembling. But the police were already bursting through the front entrance. They saw me standing there, bloodied and aggressive looking. They saw the scuffle. They didn't see the men running away. They only saw the danger. An officer shouted for me to get on the ground. I looked at Leo, terrified that if I moved, they would shoot. I slowly raised my hands and dropped to my knees. I told Leo it was going to be okay, even as the handcuffs clicked around my wrists, locking me tight. The ride to the police station was a blur of flashing lights and static-filled radio chatter. I sat in the back of the cruiser, my hands cuffed behind my back, the metal biting into my wrists. My face was throbbing where one of the men had landed a punch, and my ribs felt like they might be cracked, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the turmoil in my mind. I kept replaying the scene in the warehouse over and over again. I had seen the look in Leo's eyes. It wasn't the look of indifference I was so used to. It was fear, but it was also something else. It was recognition. He had seen me step in front of him. He had seen me take the blows meant for him. He had seen me choose his safety over my own. When we arrived at the station, I was processed like a common criminal. They took my mugshot, they took my fingerprints, and they stuffed my personal belongings into a plastic bag. The booking officer asked me what happened, but I was careful with my words. I knew that if I told them the full story, Leo might be implicated as an accomplice or a victim, which would lead to social services, to group homes, to a life in the system that would chew him up and spit him out. I took the blame. I told them I went there to buy drugs, that the transaction went wrong, and that I started the fight. It was a lie that could ruin me, a lie that would give me a criminal record, but I didn't care. The only thing that mattered was keeping Leo safe. When I asked about the boy, I told him he was just a random kid I found there, that I didn't know who he was. It was a flimsy lie, and I saw the skepticism in the officer's eyes, but without Leo contradicting me, there was nothing they could do. They threw me into a holding cell. It was a small, concrete box with a metal bench and a stainless steel toilet combination. The air smelled of stale sweat and industrial cleaner. The heavy steel door slammed shut with a deafening clang that echoed in my bones. I sat down on the hard bench, burying my face in my hands. The adrenaline was wearing off, replaced by a deep, aching exhaustion. I wondered where Leo was now. I hoped he had run away before the police had fully secured the scene. I hoped he was back home, or somewhere safe. I hoped he understood why I did what I did. Hours passed. The fluorescent light buzzed incessantly, a constant reminder of my artificial environment. I thought about the adoption again. I remembered the day the judge finalized it. I remembered looking at Leo, expecting a smile, or maybe just a handshake. Instead, he had just looked at his shoes. I had told myself then that love wasn't a switch you flipped, it was a garden you tended, even through the winter. But this winter felt like it would never end. I had sacrificed my freedom for a kid who wouldn't even call me dad. Was I foolish? Was I delusional? Maybe. But as I sat there in the cold silence of the cell, I knew that if I had to do it again, I would. Because that was what a father did. It didn't matter if the title was spoken aloud. It mattered in the actions, in the sacrifices, in the blood, and the bruises. Eventually, a guard came to the cell door. He told me I had a visitor. My heart leaped. Was it a lawyer? My mind raced through the list of people I could call. I didn't have many close friends, and my family was states away. But as the guard led me to the visiting booth, separated by a thick pane of plexiglass, I saw a figure sitting in the chair on the other side. It was small, wearing an oversized hoodie with the hood pulled up. It was Leo. He looked up as I sat down, his eyes red and puffy, as if he had been crying for hours. He picked up the phone receiver on his side, his hand shaking so badly he almost dropped it. I picked up mine. I pressed the receiver to my ear, waiting to hear his voice, wondering what he would say, terrified that this was the moment he would reject me for good, that my arrest was the final proof that I was a failure. But he didn't speak. He just looked at me, his eyes swimming with tears, his lower lip trembling violently. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The connection was filled with the static of the telephone line and the heavy sound of our breathing. I looked at Leo, really looked at him past the anger and the defiance, and saw just how scared he was. The tough guy exterior, the street-hardened attitude, it had all crumbled away in the face of my sacrifice. He was just a frightened little boy who had been backed into a corner, and for the first time, someone had stepped in front of him to take the hit. I didn't press him to speak. I just sat there, letting my gaze convey what I couldn't say aloud. I wanted him to know that it was okay, that I wasn't angry, that I would do it again 1,000 times. Finally, he broke the silence. His voice was barely a whisper, cracking under the weight of his emotions. He asked me why. He wanted to know why I did it, why I took the fall for him, why I protected him when he had been so terrible to me. It was the question I had been asking myself in the cell, but hearing him ask it made the answer crystal clear. I told him that he was my son, and that was what fathers did. I told him that it didn't matter how he treated me or what he called me. He was my responsibility and my family. I told him that I loved him, not because he was perfect, but because he was mine. The tears began to spill over his lashes, tracking down his cheeks. He gripped the receiver so hard his knuckles turned white. He started to apologize, a torrent of words tumbling out so fast I could barely keep up. He told me about the drugs, about the gang, about how he had gotten in over his head trying to fit in, trying to feel powerful because he felt so helpless at home. He admitted that he pushed me away because he was afraid to care, afraid that if he let me in, I would leave just like everyone else in his life. He told me he felt like he didn't deserve a family, so he tried to destroy the one he had. Listening to him, my heart broke 1,000 times. This was the root of the indifference. It wasn't hatred. It was a defense mechanism, a wall built to protect a fragile heart that had been broken too many times. I listened to every word, absorbing his pain. I didn't interrupt. I didn't judge. I just let him empty his soul. When he finished, he slumped in the chair, exhausted. I told him that we would fix this, that we would get through the legal trouble, and that we would deal with the gang issue together with the police now that it was out in the open. I told him that the past 2 years of silence were water under the bridge. I told him that we had a fresh start, right there in a prison visiting room. A guard approached, signaling that our time was up. Leo didn't want to let go of the phone. He looked at me with a desperation I had never seen before. I assured him I would be out soon, that I had a lawyer coming, and that he should go home and lock the door. As he stood up to leave, he paused. He pressed his hand against the glass, finger splayed. I pressed mine against the other side, matching his palm to palm. It was the first physical connection we had shared in 2 years. The cold glass was the only barrier between us, but the emotional wall that had stood between us for so long was finally gone. He nodded at me, a silent promise, and then he walked away. I watched him go, feeling lighter than I had in years. The arrest had cost me my freedom for a night, but it had bought me something far more valuable. It had bought me my son. I was released the next morning on bail, thanks to a colleague I hadn't spoken to in years, but who was willing to vouch for me. The ride home was surreal. The city looked the same, the streets were busy, people were going about their daily lives, but I felt like a different person returning to a different life. The bruises on my face were turning a sickly purple, and my ribs were wrapped tight, but my spirit was soaring. I wasn't sure what I would find when I walked through the front door. The night before had been a breakthrough, but the light of day sometimes brings back the shadows. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The house was quiet, but didn't feel oppressive anymore. It felt still. Leo was sitting on the couch, his elbows on his knees, hands clasped together. He stood up as soon as he saw me. He looked at my face, wincing at the sight of the bruises. He walked over to me slowly, stopping just a few feet away. We stood there for a moment. The silence comfortable now, filled with understanding rather than resentment. He reached out, hesitantly, and touched my arm, as if to make sure I was real. He started to speak, his voice husky from crying the night before. He told me he had cleaned up his room. He told me he had thrown away the burner phone the gang had given him. He told me he wanted to go back to school, to do things right. It was a list of promises, a roadmap for the future. I listened, nodding, feeling a swell of pride in my chest that had nothing to do with achievement and everything to do with survival. Then, the moment came. The moment I had waited 2 years for, the moment I had secretly begun to believe would never happen. He looked me in the eye, his gaze steady and clear. He took a deep breath, as if preparing to dive deep underwater. He stumbled over his words at first, his voice catching in his throat. He tried to say Lucas, but the name tasted wrong in his mouth now. He shook his head slightly, correcting himself. He said the word he had refused to say for 730 days. He called me Dad. The sound of that single syllable hung in the air, piercing through the layers of hurt and silence. It wasn't just a label, it was an acceptance. It was an admission of belonging. It was the key finally turning in the lock. My eyes filled with tears, blurring my vision. I didn't try to hide them. I reached out and pulled him into a hug. He didn't stiffen. He didn't pull away. He leaned into me, burying his face in my shoulder, and for the first time since I had known him, he let himself be held. He let himself be a child. He let himself be loved. We stood there in the middle of the living room, holding onto each other while the morning sun streamed through the windows. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There were legal issues to resolve, trust to rebuild, and scars that would take a long time to fade. The silence in the house was gone, replaced by the sound of a future being built, one fragile brick at a time. I realized then that love doesn't always arrive gently. Sometimes it has to break down the door. Sometimes it has to get arrested in a rainy warehouse to make itself heard. But when it finally breaks through, it changes everything. I looked down at the boy who was finally my son, and I knew that no matter what came next, we would face it together. Because now he had a name for me, and I had my son back,